Well, welcome to the Composable Orchestration with Uniform Bootcamp course, lesson number 5, the last lesson in this bootcamp. Today, we are talking about transitioning from DXP to DXC. And our presenter is the one and only Tim Bennix. He's the principal developer advocate at Uniform. If you want to learn more about him, I have a great interview that you probably know him already. But if you don't know him, go check out the interview I did with him. It's located in the interview section, the overview section of this bootcamp. With that said, let's go ahead and bring Tim in. Tim, welcome. Glad to have you
Hello.
back. I'm going to
Thank
let you
you.
get started. For those of you watching live, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. Tim, it's all yours.
All right, here we go. So today we will be talking about transitioning from the traditional DXP to DXC, the new kid in town. So here we go. Let's see if we can go to the next slide. There it is. So I think the question on most people's minds is like, what is the difference between these two? Because they are both saying digital experience. The one is a digital experience platform. The other one is digital experience composition. And we might even call that digital experience composition platform. So I think today I want to go over all kind of the differences between these two, and then we dive into DXC a little bit more, especially about what it is not, and then later on even of the extra little bits that Uniform attaches to the traditional DXC ideas that we have now. So actually, DXP and DXC both have the same outcome because what they do is they deliver an easy way for business users and content editors to kind of visually create experiences and add some personalization and a whole bunch of stuff. And the main thing here is that it's visual, it's usable. Content editors can go a very long way without bothering developers, things like that. So they both have that goal in mind. The difference is that the underlying architecture is fundamentally changed from DXP to DXC. And so let's dive into that a little bit first. So let's start with the DXP, the traditional architecture. And so generally, a DXP has a CMS as its core, as its base, and it has a bunch of tools added on top to make it more of an experience platform. Because when we started way back when, we had this web CMS thing, and then it slowly people needed to have more control as content editors and less developer focus first, right? And so they started with the CMS and then bolted stuff on. And this is what generally what DXP architectures are dealing with. And so generally, I'm not saying for all of them, but most of these DXP architectures are actually running on like a self-service hosting or maybe managed hosting. And with that comes a whole bunch of things, like because when the DXP updates, you apply these updates because you manage the hosting, right? You have to deal with these things. And then if you have customized something, you will also have to then deal with that customization and the applied update. And so if you get a Christmas peak or a Black Friday peak, you scale that hosting up and you deal with it. And if you have to do maintenance, database cleanup, whatever, it all comes on your plate as the architect or the DevOps owner or whatever you want to call it, right? And so on top of that, also because these DXPs stem from a slightly older time, they have a legacy. And legacy is not per se bad. They chose a certain programming language on how to build certain things. And because of that, if you want to attach things to this DXP or extend it to other things, you have to take into account that you have to do programming in the same way as the DXP has it done. And so we know this a little bit as vendor lock-in, especially as front-end developers like me, if they have chosen a certain approach, and then you have to keep choosing that. And then because otherwise you don't have success with the system, it's sometimes quite challenging for developers in an ever-changing world to keep using that stuff from 3 years ago. And you know what? Sometimes that stuff is great. Sometimes it's not. It's all based on how much flexibility do you want as a developer, as a brand, how flexibility in maintenance, bug fixing, but also changing up your system, right? And because they started from a general CMS and then added stuff on top, they are not always fully, there's not full coverage with APIs for all the features. And also because a lot of DXPs didn't start out to be headless. They only added that on top, another bolt on. And we kind of call this like a semi-headless, because if they go full headless right now, they kind of alienate 10 years of history of people using their tool a different way. So they have to find a mix. So it's semi-headless, and that can sometimes be tricky. If it works, it works, be happy, but generally it's hard. And so now let's talk about DXC. And remember, it has the same goal, but the tech below it is very different. So generally DXCs are cloud native, and all the tools they connect to are also cloud native. And with cloud native, a lot of cool things come, like updates are automatic because the company that you are paying to actually build your DXC orchestrator or your platform actually does these updates for you, right? It happens in the cloud where it stays, no worries. They are API first because they're built in a modern time. And the big thing is that they're tech agnostic. They're just APIs. You talk to the APIs, you use them. You might have SDKs for specific tech to make things easier, but that doesn't mean that you cannot use them with tech that you choose. It generally just works. And that's a huge one for us developers. And also that means it's also great for marketers and maybe product owners, because if you want to change and you want to add another channel like an iPhone app or something, the fact that it's tech agnostic makes your tech team say, do you want it this week or next, rather than maybe in 6 months, right? It's a very different conversation. And it's not a CMS. And you might, we'll talk a little bit later on this CMS business, because you can store information in your DXC, but it's not at its core a CMS. A CMS is just part of the DXC as one of the components you're kind of compose with. So, and we'll talk about that a little later. So essentially, this is a sentence that would say what DXC is. DXC allows you to select modern API-first vendors and integrate them, while enabling business users to work easily across these tools. And so what that means is you connect all these tools, but then your content editors don't always have to understand exactly how that DAM system works or how that PIM system works, because in the DXC, in the end editor interface of that DXC, they are so well integrated that we kind of don't call this integration anymore. We call this orchestration. The content editor doesn't have to understand the other system to use it. So, oh, Marcelo is in.
Yes, I'm in. Real quick on that, if you go back. So that means that not only you have your content editors that really don't need to know where this data is coming from or this content, right? Because they're just working on the web, the mobile, whatever. But that means you also have domain-specific people, right? That can continue working on Salesforce and continue working on their PIM and continue working on their DAM. And that has nothing to do with how it's going to be delivered, right? So you can
Totally.
you can have separations of concerns like that as well.
Yeah, and in a few slides we will get there, and I'll give you a
Oh, I
lovely
jumped the gun.
example. Yeah, that's so
Sorry.
good, because you're right for coming in here with this, because this is a huge point that we
Right.
love to see with DXC, right? The separation of concerns, but we'll get there, I promise.
Excellent.
Let's first talk about what DXC is actually not, because there's a few other players in this space, and DXC is really new, right? And so we're all trying to kind of figure out, what is DXC? If I do this, am I now a DXC, and can I get the traction of the market? Or do I need to do a little bit more or a little bit less this direction? And so what DXC is not is just a data aggregator layer. Like, you have a bunch of tools out there that say, okay, you have 5 headless sources. Let me just grab all their data and put it in one place, so your developer can just query that one place. So you get all the stuff, right? That's a lovely thing to do on its own, but you're not a DXC if you just do that part, because DXC also allows content editors to work with these integrations rather than just tech people connect to them. It's also not a backend for frontend, this BFF that we like to call this. A backend for frontend is generally a system where components are defined and you add data to these components, and marketers can really easily work with these. So that kind of sounds like what you have in a DXC as well that we just discussed. However, BFFs only do that. And also, BFFs generally have a lot of opinion of, okay, we made these components, but they're only in React, or they're only with PHP, or whatever language you want. So they kind of lock you in a little bit. You have to use their SDK to be able to work with that system. It's not very open. And of course, these BFF systems out there now realize this, and they're, of course, expanding and changing up. But if you're just one of those backend for front-end layers, you are not a full DXC. And also, if you are a CMS, you're not a DXC, because the whole idea is to not have one center of the universe where everything is plugged in. You should actually be able to plug out the DXC and everything still works, or take out, right? So it's not CMS centric. We'll talk about that in a second, because that's also why Marcelo just jumped in to talk about that. The DXC changes the paradigm of how data flows, but we'll get there in a sec. So what is DXC actually, right? Well, actually, it's a combination of all those three that we just mentioned and a bunch more things. And so this is a pretty big slide here. So I'll leave that on for a second. And so what you should know about this, that this is actually DXC in the eyes of uniform, right? So this is DXC plus the added fanciness of uniform. And so uniform, in our opinion, is DXC plus a little bit. Correct me if I'm wrong, my dear bosses, but this is what I'm going with right now. So if we have a look at what we see here in this image, we have the composable services below, which is like your content, your media, your Salesforce, all the sources. And then you have this API orchestration bit. Then we have an experience layer where you can actually build your pages. But there's a whole bunch more. There's some front-end related things. There's edge hosting. There's edge personalization. And so there's a whole bunch more. So let's start here first. So this composable API orchestration is basically where you integrate all these different sources of your data into. And this system allows you to plug systems in really easily and always in the same way. It works extremely well, and it has super solid APIs for developers to query, but also for the next bit, which is here the experience layer, to talk to. Because in your no-code editor, where you can drag and drop components that you have defined, you should also be able to talk to all the data from all these systems, and that's what this API orchestration layer gives you. And in a proper DXC, you can do it in a way where you can attach a resource, let's say something out of a CMS, or a list of things from, let's say, an events platform. You connect that as a resource to a page, and all the components have different fields, right? And so what you can do in a proper DXC with a nice no-code experience editor, you can actually select that resource, attach it to a component, and select only the fields that you want, and it fills it up. But if you then also like to enrich it with the YouTube API because of a whole bunch of extra metadata, you attach that resource as well. And then you literally just click and drag the data that you need, and your components are filled with data. What that also means is if you want to change your CMS to another one, you do a few clicks and you remap the result of the API to your fields, you're good to go. Then there's an extra magical bit where uniform shines specifically, which is edge caching and edge rendering and tracking. So what that means is you can have all these sources all together. Imagine you're not caching that. Well, that's going to be one page with 100 API calls. That's going to be slow, right? And uniform has this amazing ability to kind of cache the results of the composable API orchestration layer, the first red dots that we saw, and then surgically uncache and purge that cache specifically. And because it's on the edge, it's close to the user. So you can have a fully server-side rendered page cached from the edge in 50 milliseconds, which is amazing. And if you do your job right, you uncache it correctly as the DXC. And then all should be good, nothing too complex. And on top of that, it can actually do personalization on the edge as well. So if you go to a page that's in France and I go to one in Germany, that same fast result actually has a different personalized output, because that's what you want with DXCs. You want to be able to personalize all that stuff. And so the last red dots on the right side is basically like, in the context of all these things, we have to be able to do some experimentation, testing, tracking of users, insights, all this stuff that sits there. So I hope this kind of helps you out with seeing how this DXC fits, because all of these things are loosely coupled. You can remove one and everything is still fine generally. So Marcelo, here's your about your question. There is a new flow of data. There's a new paradigm of how this works. And we call this domain data versus design data. And this is where things start to be really different from the DXP. Because in a DXP, you have all your data in that CMS. And then you build pages in your CMS, right? So your CMS is a data store for your base data for that stuff that worked in 10 years. But it also hosts how you design a page in a certain context for a user. So that's more volatile data that might maybe after this campaign dies and you change it up, right? And so mixing these two things in a CMS can be quite messy. And so in a DXC, this does not happen. It's actually very different. The DXC simplifies everything. The page design of the context of the user. So if I'm on a phone from France, my page design looks this way. If I'm on an iPad in Germany, my page looks that way. If I'm on a desktop in New York, my page looks that way. And it doesn't all have to mean personalization. It's context aware, and all your design data of how all these components work live in the DXC. And all the rest is separated out into all the tools that you have connected. So your Headless CMS has specific data that we call domain data. That is data that defines your product, your brand, stuff that worked in 10 years, right? Just like product or PIMs or things like that, where the product data is enriched, but only product data. So as an example, for example, think about, let's say you have a Headless CMS and you have an events website. So in your CMS, what you have is you have event venues, you have artists, you have dates, you have things around the event that you need to know to be able to go there, or like finding your way, things like that. And that's fully data modeled in that CMS, because a new event happens next week. There's an artist, there's a date, there's a venue, there's an amount of people that are allowed to go, there are tickets, all that stuff, right? And your tickets are probably in your PIM, right? So domain data is specific to the domain of what that system is amazing at. Because imagine, let's say that that event is next week. In a traditional system, in a DXP, what you maybe want to do is add a checkbox to that event to make it featured, because on the homepage now, next week, the new event is coming up. Let's make it big and flashy and add like a banner, and maybe make it red, whatever, right? Make it more popping. If you now actually go into your data model and add that checkbox for featured, that works for that week, right? But what happens if that event is shown, let's say, in a search result? That checkbox makes no sense, but it's in your data model and will forever be there. And I've seen projects where you had 25 checkboxes and some drop downs and extra fields just to be able to switch the context and for different things. So then for mobile, this checkbox is red, and for desktop, this checkbox is red, and let's show it like this. And then in a year, you look back and you're like, I don't know why these checkboxes are here. Let me just remove one because I don't need it. And then your Indian website is completely crashed and you didn't know why.
I want to jump in here because this is getting into that content modeling, which I'm a big fan
Exactly.
of, and
Yeah.
and I think it's really important. Another example is you have an FAQ, right, where you're storing everything in the CMS and it's question answer, and you want to display it, like you said, you display it on the mobile or on the website one way, but you also want to share with Salesforce for customer support so they can share it with their, right? And over there, you need no design at all. You're just sharing FAQs. when you're mixing it up, right, in the CMS, now you have basically dirty data, right, that you're
Exactly.
providing that has nothing to do. So it's not domain data anymore. So yeah, I love those examples, and I love that fact that in a DXC you can totally keep that design uh, content completely separate from the domain content. Really important aspect of it, in my
And
opinion.
what I love about this as well is the more mature you get as a company, the bigger you get, the more specialists you're going to hire to deal with certain data. Like I've
Right.
worked with companies in the past when I was at agency that had 4 people that were dealing with search results. These shoes cannot be next to that bag and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. And we had people that were like, there was like 8 people writing copy that is approved by the president of the company.
Right.
And so, what if a content editor had to do that and then put it in the CMS in 60 languages or whatever, right? That's really messy.
Right.
So, if you have the system like a DXC where you have your domain data on different places and you can just connect it up, the content editor, the job of the content editor is just pick the right stuff and then make
Right.
it look amazing. But then
Right.
you can have a team that is just dealing with approved copy. You have a team that is just dealing with translations. You have a team that is just dealing with maturing your products in the PIM system or updating your Algolia index so it's really well tuned. You separate out how people work. And if you scale to a big scale, like you have 50 markets and you have different tools, DXC is almost inevitable.
Right.
And I'm so
And the
surprised. Look,
ROI on it is huge.
oh, it's huge. The bigger you get, the more serious
Right.
you are as a company with all these different levels, the ROI shoots up,
Right.
basically.
Yep. Definitely. Cool.
So I really wanted to talk about that difference in approach. And it makes it extremely flexible. So in the end, the DXC and the DXP actually have different outcome or sorry, similar outcomes and goals, but how they get there is quite different and the tech below it is especially different. And so DXC kind of offers more flexibility and it's also technically agnostic. Um, where content editors can just deal with stuff without calling developers because that happened to me a lot when I was a developer where something just wouldn't work, right? And in here, of course, things always don't really work. That's normal, but at least here you have flexibility to fix it really easily. All right, so we are now at our terminology recap. Luckily, this wasn't the longest bootcamp session, so we don't have to go too deep. So, what is a DXP? You have to know this is a digital experience platform that is now becoming legacy. Still works, but is legacy. Then we have DXC, which is the new kid on the block, which is digital experience composition. Um, and well, we just went over all the differences, so hopefully you remember that for your later on when you do the test. Also, you need to know what cloud native is. We went over that quite fast. So cloud native is basically a tool that lives in the cloud and is using tools that are also in that cloud. So there's not that much custom stuff, and there's not so much for you to maintain because the cloud service offers that for you. So it's a lot easier. Then we have managed hosting. Um, Basically, this can be in the cloud, but you control how it's hosted, or a company controls that server for you and they provisioned it for you, but it's still managed. You have to do stuff for it. Then we have the domain data versus the design data, which we just spoke about. So, domain data is data that is non changeable and defines your brand or product. It works in every channel, from a bus stop to a phone, and it's still good in 10 years. Design data is much more volatile because it's in context of a thing at a time. For example, we have one campaign this week, so everything looks this way. That's much more design oriented, or it's 2 columns or 5 columns. That's design data. Um, that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free. Marcelo, any last thoughts?
The last one, I got to say, as a content modeler, the last one to me is extremely important because it sets up your organization for scalability for the future.
Mhm.
Where when you throw away that design that now looks old and you want to add new channels, you haven't polluted your domain content with stuff that you don't need in there. So that to me is amazing. But the only other thought besides that is, Tim, as always, amazing job, man. Always.
Thank you.
We can always count on you doing a great job. So thank you so much. If people want to get a hold of you, the Twitter right there is the best.
Here, this is Twitter.
Come on, you can do it. You can do it.
Yeah, you've done that many times.
I can do this in my sleep, man. You can wake me up and I go, right there.
Yeah, I'm not there yet.
All right, Tim. Thank you so much. And thanks for the rest of you for attending this bootcamp. It's over. This bootcamp is done. But you can continue your journey learning all about DXC. We have a course called Beginner's Guide to DXC. It's on headlesscreator.com. So go get your free account there and you'll be able to start that course. We're going to be adding tons of lessons to it. So make sure you get that account. Also, if you want to get your knowledge certificate on this bootcamp, make sure you use the study guides, which are included in the advanced section. You'll be able to study all of that, and then you'll be able to go ahead and get the exam and get your certificate and tell the world that you are fully knowledgeable on DXC. And as always, if you want to get a hold of me, right there, see, I can do this, no problem. Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. So we will see you on the Beginner's Guide to DXC course. Have a great one, everybody. Cheers.